Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. Good to see you and to be with the viewers and the listeners.
Yeah, likewise. Well, last week we were covering the history of economic thought, and we talked about the economic phenomenon that was taking place before 1776. And then we got to 1776 with Adam Smith's great treatise, The Wealth of Nations. And then we worked our way up through the 19th century, through the classical economists, people like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill. And we got all the way up to what is really known as a revolution in economic thought that took place around 1870. And that's become known as the marginal revolution. It consisted of three economists coming up with pretty much the same idea, although independent of each other: William Stanley Jevons, Eugene Valra, and Carl Menger. So I thought we would start here, part two of the history of economic thought, with that revolution. What do you think?
Absolutely. Well, as you were just saying, there comes a major change in the way economists came to think about what determines the value of goods and the determination of the prices of commodities in the marketplace, and how that impacts upon the determination of the prices of the factors of production: wages for labor, rent for land, interest on capital, the prices of other factors, and so on. And this is known as the marginalist revolution. It all happened in the early 1870s because of the almost simultaneous discovery of the idea of what is known as marginal utility or marginal decision making by three economists, one in Britain, one in France, and one in Austria. In Great Britain, it was William Stanley Jevons. In France, it was Leon Valra. And in Austria, it was Carl Menger. The strange coincidence is that two of them, Menger and Jevons, actually published their versions of this idea in the same year, 1871. And they were followed 3 years later in 1874 by Leon Valra. These three economists did not know about each other's ideas, in fact, about their existence of each other when they first published and came up with their ideas. Jevons found out about Menger. Menger then discovered about Jevons. Valra and Menger actually discovered each other after Valra's book came out, and they exchanged letters comparing their two versions of this marginalist idea and its implications. But they each developed this idea. And what did it mean? Well, in essence, or in a sense, they turned the classical economist conception of the value of goods on its head. The classical economists, as we discussed last time, developed what became known as the labor theory of value. What determines the relative values of goods in terms of each other on the market was derived from the quantity of human labor that had gone into its input. So in other words, if one good involves 3 hours of labor and another goods manufacture involves an hour and a half of labor, then 2 units of the good that requires an hour and a half of labor per unit should trade for the one that costs 3 hours of labor time. Now, we also discussed the fact that a particular twist on this later in the 19th century was with the coming of Karl Marx and the development of what we now call Marxian economics. And that was, Marx took this idea and said that if, in fact, the value of goods is based upon the labor input that goes into their relative manufacture, then how is it that the workers do not get the full value of their labor? That is, the private businessman, the private employer, hires the worker, and yet the worker does not get the full value of what he has produced. The worker produces 10 units of output and some market value of those 10 units, but the employer, the private enterprise, the owner of the private means of production, siphons off, takes away from him, as Marx would say, expropriates, let's say 3 of the 10 units and its market value. And therefore, the capitalist has taken that which belongs to another through the sweat of the brow of the real producer of all that is available for use and consumption in society. And that is the basis of Marx's theory of exploitation. Now, what Jevons and Laurent and Menger did was to, in a sense, turn that argument on its head. The simplest way to think about it is that let us suppose that someone decided to go to the beach and play in the sand. And he spent an entire day, 8 hours of labor time, making mud pies out of the wet sand. Uh, Merely because he's devoted 8 hours of labor time, does that assure him that he will have a market value for his output? And the answer is no. If no one wants mud pies made at the seashore, then those 8 hours of labor time have no market value. So the implication here was it is not the quantity of labor that goes into the manufacture of a good that determines the value of that good relative to other things in the marketplace, but rather it's because goods have value to the user that people see a motive and interest and a value to applying labor and other resources for its manufacture. Now, that idea that another way of putting it is that it is beauty that defines something, it is the eye of the beholder that defines beauty, and not the fact that the painter has devoted years to making the work of art that gives its value, is the core of this idea. What they extended with that then is that not only is it the user's perception of the value of something that imputes a value to the object and its manufacture, but then the idea of marginal decision making. The other aspect of the classical economists, starting with Adam Smith, was the idea of treating the desire or the need or the value of goods as lump sums. Adam Smith creates a paradox in the Wealth of Nations. He says that there's a peculiarity. Water is essential for life. If all of us don't drink a minimal amount of water, we die. But what is generally the market value of water, either at or near zero? On the other hand, diamonds are a superfluous thing. They're baubles that we put on as jewelry and to make ourselves more attractive to others, let's say. Therefore, they're not essential to human life. Yet, what is their market value? It has a high market value. And that became the paradox of value. That which has a high use value, that is, sustaining life, has a low market value, water. On the other hand, that which has a low use value, we can live without diamonds, even though Marilyn Monroe did say diamonds are a girl's best friend, has a high exchange value. Now, how is this paradox to be explained? And both Jevons and Menger and Vauban, each in their own way, said that that was the wrong way of looking at it. We never choose in almost all normal circumstances between all diamonds and all water. We choose between incremental amounts of it. And as we acquire additional units of a particular good, the first diamond, the second diamond, the third diamond, the fourth diamond, the fifth diamond, the sixth diamond, we apply each additional unit of this good to a descending order of importance. If we have no diamonds, to what use do we apply the first diamond, the most important, highly valued use of a diamond? What about the second diamond that comes our way? The second most important use, and then the third most important use, the fourth most important use, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, in a descending ordered ranking of relative importance to us, the evaluator and chooser. Now, in most situations that people live in, there is a vast quantity of water. So each additional increment of water, buckets of water, barrels of water, glasses of water, have been assigned to uses for water in a descending order. And because of such a plentifulness of it, the last barrels, buckets, glasses of water have basically a superfluous use to us. Their marginal value to us is at or near zero. However, diamonds, relative to our uses, purposes, applications of them, is far more scarce. So as we get this less available good, the first diamond, the second diamond, the third diamond, those units are still applied to purposes that have a relatively higher use value to us. Therefore, when someone says, well, I have a bucket of water to sell, and how many buckets of water would you be willing to take if I was in exchange for one more of your diamonds? That diamond, that unit, that marginal unit of the diamond has a much more highly valued use and importance than the 950 millionth barrel, bucket, or glass of water. And therefore, that explains the paradox that the marginal unit and utility or usefulness of one more bucket or barrel or glass of water is far less, practically near zero for many people, compared to one more increment or unit of diamond they could have. Now, that explains the relative values of goods in general, the relative demands and uses of them in comparison to the availability of the units for both for one person and competing individuals in the marketplace. That really, if you think about it and logically follow it, shatters the entire labor theory of value. That explains why goods have value and what determines the value of labor. That which has a high value as a good will be valued highly enough to pay other people a higher wage or a higher price to supply its manufacture. On the other hand, that which has a low market value, people will only pay a small amount for people to supply those goods. So in fact, what determines wages, what determines the value of other resources, capital, land, those values of the factors of production are imputed, assigned, extended to the means through which the good itself can be manufactured. But it is the end, the goal, the purpose that has value, and then we assign value to that which that can be used to bring it to a finished form for our use, enjoyment, and consumption. That shatters the entire approach. Now, what the marginalist revolutionists did, and I should point out, it's not as if there was a sort of like the conversion on the road to Damascus, where suddenly Jevons, Menger, and Walras present this idea, and the entire economics profession changes their mind overnight. It took a good quarter of a century, that is from the early 1870s to about the beginning of the 20th century, 1900, let's say, as a benchmark, to bring about a transformation, a conversion, if you will, of the economics profession to increasingly and then predominantly and then therefore almost all economists accepting the new marginalist conception of what economics was about. Now, what other form was this important for? And let me do an extension of this if I can, in response to Marx as well. Each of these approaches, Jevons, Walras, and Menger's, followed different paths, primarily because Jevons and Walras viewed that economics should be modeled after the natural sciences. And the main analytical and logical tool of reasoning in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, for instance, is the method of logic of quantity and comparison of quantities, and that is mathematics. So both Jevons and Walras chose to follow a mathematical formulation of the development of this new marginalist approach to economics. The Austrians chose to follow a different path. Menger, from his own book, which in English has the simple and mundane title, Principles of Economics, said that each subject matter must have its own method of analysis to fit the nature, qualities, and characteristics of the subject matter that the analyst, the scientist, is attempting to understand, analyze, and evaluate. Mathematics may be useful in the natural sciences, where we're mostly dealing with quantities, the relationships between quantities, and the relative interactions of quantities. But in the human sciences, in the social sciences, in a field such as economics, we are talking about acting, choosing, volitional individuals who have something that inanimate matter does not, and that is consciousness, thought, expectation, evaluation, memory, judgment. And therefore, we're dealing with the element of purposefulness, which a rock and the molecules of which water is made do not possess. And therefore, Menger's approach was to say that we must do our analysis based upon logical, discursive reasoning, focusing on understanding the logic of the working of the human mind. And the human mind does not work in terms of rarefied, quantifiable relationships, but intentional comparisons of states of affairs, imagined end goals, perceived and pictured uses of means to achieve ends, and their evaluative judgments about how to go best to achieving their goals, purposes, and ends. And therefore, they followed two different routes in this. And that became the particular strand in the Austrian school of developing this. Menger had two major followers that developed his ideas. One was Friedrich von Wieser, and the other was Eugen von Bismarck. They were students together. In graduate school, they discovered Menger's book, which had come out about the time they were beginning graduate school. They really didn't meet Menger himself for several years, but they became inspired by Menger's book, went to graduate school together. They ended up becoming brothers-in-law. Von Bismarck married Wieser's sister. And as an aside, I've seen a picture of von Bismarck's wife. And it's a good thing that Wieser's sister didn't look like Wieser for von Bismarck's sake. But that's a different matter. But I digress. But anyway, I can't help it. It comes out, Jacob. It comes out.
You know, when you mention Marx, I sometimes get the impression that you resemble more Groucho when you make some of these stupid jokes.
I remember. I resemble that, Ron. I resemble that, Ron. See, you bring this out of me. You're the bad boy. You're the bad boy.
Let me interrupt you here for a second. I know you're on a roll here, but before we go on to the development of these schools. I think your analysis on your analogy of beauty lies in the beholder is really good because this has also been called the subjective theory of value revolution. Right. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's the idea that the value of a good is based on how people perceive it. And that's entirely subjective. That's the humanity that you were alluding to. This deals with choices. For example, you were talking about diamonds. Let's say that there's a guy that digs a deep hole in the ground and finds diamonds, but it takes him a year to dig this hole, like this mine, and he finally finds this beautiful diamond. While another guy happens to be just walking down the desert, and there's the same quality of diamond.
Absolutely.
You know, the labor theory of value would say, well, the guy that had the mine, that his diamond is much more valuable. But the fallacy of it is that they're both of equal value in the eyes of the beholder. It doesn't matter to the beholder how much labor goes into producing the diamond.
That is a perfect example. You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right about that.
Yeah, and so that had a major impact on Marx's labor theory of value.
Right.
And I mean, it destroyed it. I mean,
yes.
Because now all of his arguments that what belongs to the owner and the entrepreneur, what they're stealing from the worker because the worker's he's put all his labor into the value, just goes out the window. Because the value of whatever's produced is really subjective. It lies in the eyes of the beholder. So I wanted to point that out. And so, I want you to develop now, because now we got essentially maybe three schools of thought. You can correct me on that. But you got three economists here that have this major revolutionary idea on this subjective theory of value or marginal utility theory of value. You've got Menger, who's really the founder of the Austrian school, to which you and I subscribe, and I think most libertarians, well, I'd say many libertarians subscribe. And then, but then you have Valra, you have Jevons. And so how do you want to work this? You want to explain how you started to talk about Wieser and von Bismarck. They come after Menger. So why don't we start with that Austrian branch and see what happens there, and then we'll go into what happens with the other two.
Right. Now the Wieser's important contribution, and this is in one form recognized by most economists, regardless of their school of thought, if you will, is that Wieser came up with the idea that what determines the value of any good, and it's its opportunity cost. That is, what is the cost of a choice? It is the next best alternative that has been foregone to achieve another purpose. Let's talk about the listeners or viewers who have chosen to watch our discussion today. What has been the cost of their choice? What have they given up to do this viewing or listening? And what it is each of them to ask in their mind, what would they have been doing with this block of time, approximately a half hour or so? What would they be doing with their time? Because time is a scarce resource. What would they be doing with their time right now if they had chosen not to be listening and viewing us? That is the cost of any choice. That which you gave up to follow another chosen path that you valued as more valuable, and therefore incurring that cost or expense or paying that price to get it. So basically, what our viewers and listeners are right now saying, Jacob, is that we're more valuable than anything else they could do. Now, in my case, that's understandable, but that's the cost of your choice. Now, to emphasize this subjectivist element to it. How do you measure that? Where does this alternative foregone exist? This emphasizes that very subjectivist element that you highlighted correctly a moment ago. It is in the mind of the chooser. The fact is, by someone sitting in front of their computer, their laptop, even on their phone, and watching this right now, means that that segment of time is not being used for something else. And that something else that they could have done never comes into existence. It's a might have been. It's an imagined possibility in their mind if they reflected upon what they gave up to be watching us. That means that it never has a quantifiable dimension. It never is real. While this word has a certain sort of negative connotation, I mean it not that way. It is a fantasy in our mind. As a consequence, that emphasizes that the essence of economics is different than merely the measurable and the quantifiable. We cannot escape the fact that the core concepts of economics are mental categories and relationships, and not quantifiable, external, measured amounts of things. The other element of this was Bombavrik's contribution. Now, Bombavrik was a real unbelievably methodical and careful thinker. A later Austrian named Friedrich Hayek, who we'll talk about in this context later, once compared Wieser and Bombavrik as the master and the muddler. Wieser was the kind of guy who had to sort of mull over the ideas. He always forgot his own arguments. He had to rethink himself from the start. Bombavrik was the master. He read everything in economics. He remembered everything in economics and can repeat in a clear, logical, and fair, objective way all the different ideas, even those by people who he disagreed with. That was like the master of his subject. And in that context, Bombavrik was unbelievably clear in developing Menger's theory of marginal utility and marginal use, and explaining the emergence of market value of things and the emergence of prices in that context. But he also had a primary contribution of the development of the theory of capital and interest. Capital are the produced means of production. We take our labor, we take our raw resources in the ground, and we make tools to assist us in the manufacturing process. Machines, instruments, factories. These are the produced means of production, with the assistance of which our physical labor and raw materials can be far more productive to increase the quantities, the varieties, and the qualities of the finished goods that we would desire. But all of this takes time, Bombavrik argued. If the fisherman does not want to wade into the lagoon and try to capture fish with his hands, he must take the time to pull a branch off a tree, sharpen one end of the branch, and then try to use it as a spear in the lagoon. If he wants to be more productive than that, he must set aside time and effort to cut down a tree, hollow it out as a canoe, then take other branches to carve out the paddles, and then take the vines off the trees if it's a tropical island, and weave together a net, a fishing net, so that he can in the canoe go further out into the lagoon and throw the net out, and in a matter of a few hours capture dozens upon dozens of fish. Whereas if he was doing it by hand or with the crude spear, he'd be lucky in that same amount of time to have 2 or 3. So the investment of time and resources in time-consuming production of capital goods immensely increases our productivity, and therefore, as I said, the quantities, the varieties, and the qualities of the goods that we can manufacture. But that always involves a price, and that is the cost of time. Doing things more immediately in the present, or foregoing the things we could do in the present to invest in making capital that will give us a greater output in the future. And therefore, Bombavrik argued that ultimately, capital investment is a time element, and time has a cost, the trading off of now versus later. And that is ultimately the basis and the origin of the rate of interest. Now, if I can just take the time to explain that in the context of what I consider a devastating additional criticism of Marx. Because what Bombavrek did was take the marginalist concept in the way that I and then you with the subjectivist element emphasized, and then added to that his analysis of capital and time to, if, in my humble opinion, to give the coup de grace to Marx. How so? Marx said that the worker produces 10 units of output. The businessman extracts 3 units as his demanded payment for the use of his privately owned machine and factory facilities. And therefore, that is exploitation and is the basis of the businessman's profit. The stolen wealth from the worker is the capitalist businessman's profit, and therefore profit is exploitive. Now, what Bombavrek said is that to take the time to invest in making the machines, the tools, the capital equipment, or Robinson Crusoe on his island, the canoe, the paddles, the net, you have to set aside saved means of production to undertake the production process. If I'm not fishing for fish in the lagoon by hand or with a spear, and instead I'm making the canoe and the paddles and the net, how am I eating during the time that this capital production is taking me? That means that I have to produce and that set some of my wealth aside as savings to be living off while I'm making the capital goods that will enable me to be more productive and have more consumer goods in the future. Now, all production takes time. You plant the seed, the tree grows, it matures, and then you get the apple or the orange off the vine, or off the branches. A factory has to be built. Machines have to be produced and housed in the factory. The machines have to be used with resources to, on the metaphor of an assembly line, to over a period of time come off the assembly line and finally have goods available to offer on the market to people who might be willing to buy them and pay a price for them. All of that takes time. Now, some people save out of the wealth and the prosperity they've had in the past, and others don't or haven't had the ability. As a consequence, the businessman could say to the worker, let me employ you. You devote weeks, months, maybe years of helping me undertake a time-consuming investment project. And then when we have finished the investment project and I have sold the product on the market and I get revenues from selling our units of goods to the consumers, I'll reimburse you for all the time that you've waited and taken to help me make the product. But what if the worker doesn't have this saved accumulation to live off during that time? The alternative to that is that the capitalist enterpriser, the businessman, who has had saved wealth or who has the financial means to borrow other people's savings for a period of time, which he promises to pay back, can advance the worker's wages during the period of production. You don't have to wait for the finished product to get your wage reward. The businessman pays you every 2 weeks or once a month, whatever the pay period schedule is. And then you get paid during the production process, and then the businessman sells it and hopefully will get a price from the consumers if they choose to buy it that recoups his cost of production, including advancing your wages during the production process, and hopefully from his point of view, a profit beyond, over and above his cost of manufacturing. Now, what basically the businessman is doing is advancing wages to the worker, and he's incurring the loss of time and use of his own savings and resources and capital in other ways. So what Marx considered profit exploitation, Bombavrek was able to show is really the implicit interest that the businessman receives for having used part of his savings to advance wages to the workers so they don't have to wait until the product is sold to receive the wages that represent their part of the contribution to the making of the product. What Marx confused with was profit with interest. The fact that the businessman may get more than what the product has cost to produce in terms of wages is not exploitation, but the implicit interest income for foregoing the use of his wealth in other useful ways in the present to advance wages to the workers as part of the production process for which he may receive compensation when he sells the product in the future. If you think through that, that is devastating. that undermines the entire conception of Marx that the worker is cheated. No, the worker is saved the necessity to either starve or draw upon any meager savings he himself has accumulated to wait till the product is ready to be sold. The businessman saves him that problems by paying him before the product is ready to earn a revenue. That is a profound, devastating criticism of Marx that undermines the entire Marxian edifice, including all of this Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders anti-business rhetoric. That represents the profound contributions of the first generation of the Austrian school.
Well, based on what you're saying, it sounds to me also that the businessman is bringing something into existence that he can't be for certain is going to sell under this subjective concept. I mean, he brings into something that he makes a lot of money on. It's only because other people place a value on that based on their own subjective preferences. It's entirely possible that he could be paying the workers during that entire period of time and produce something that doesn't sell, like mud pies.
Absolutely. In fact, in standard economics, almost in all economics textbook, the businessman or the entrepreneur is usually defined as the residual claimant. What the hell does that mean? It means nothing more that the businessman incurs all of these expenses during the period of production, including the wages to the workers, so they don't have to wait for the sale of the product. And then he's paid all these contractual obligations. He's paid suppliers of resources and raw materials. He's paid the guy who supplied him with the machinery for the factory. He's been paying the wages to the workers during the production process. And then he has offered the product on the market to consumers. He has incurred a speculative undertaking. He imagined what consumers may want, the qualities, features, and characteristics they might desire in the product, when he might have it available in the future. And then when the future comes, his judgment, his entrepreneurial anticipatory judgment is tested. Do consumers buy the product? How much do they buy? What price are they willing to pay? Do the number of units sold at that price that they end up willing to pay cover all of the expenses that he's incurred and maybe earned him a profit above those monetary costs of production? That is uncertain. He's the bearer of both risk and uncertainty. And that makes him the core pivotal element of the economic process. In fact, you're right to raise this because both Menger and Bombavrek and Wieser, in their beginning ways, emphasize this unique role of the entrepreneur. But in that earlier generation of this marginalist revolution, and especially this Austrian branch, and by the earlier generation, I mean up to the First World War, 1914 approximately, you had two American Austrian economists, that is, followers pretty much of the Austrian school. Actually, three. An Englishman named Philip Wicksteed, and two Americans, Frank Fetter and Herbert Davenport, who developed Menger, Bombavrek, and Wieser's ideas in ways that particularly Davenport and Philip Wicksteed highlighted that the entrepreneur is the pivotal actor in the market because he's the one who tries to look through a glass darkly, anticipating future consumer demand, what they want, what value they place upon it, how it might be manufactured, and therefore might earn him a profit to justify his expenses, including those wages to be paid. And the entrepreneur, therefore, is the hub of the wheel of guiding production. But he's not guaranteed anything. He's the bearer of risk and uncertainty because he is tested at the end of the day as to whether the consumers want upon what he has speculated incurring those expenses. He may earn a profit, he may break even, or he might suffer a loss. And the market tests his entrepreneurial acumen each and every day in comparison to the ability of his rival competitors in the market to do better than himself.
Yeah, in the most elementary production process, the entrepreneur or the owner may be starving while
Oh,
his
yes,
workers are doing fine because they've got their wage coming in.
absolutely.
And so that's, when you talk about taking the risk, yeah, he's definitely taking the risk because the worker goes home with his money every 2 weeks.
Absolutely.
Now let's put things, before we wrap things up for this week, and I think we ought to continue this conversation into part 3. But before we wrap it up, give me the historical context here. You've got the marginalist revolution with Menger's principles of economics taking place in around 1871 or so.
Mhm.
So do Wieser and Bobovik know Menger? What are their books? What years are they publishing in? And
Right.
what are they doing at this period?
Okay. Menger's book, his Principles of Economics, as it's translated into English, came out, as I said, in 1871. Uh, it's only approximately uh, 10, almost 15 years later that Wieser and Bombavik's books come out in the 1880s. About the time that Wieser's book came out, Wieser and Bombavik were in the university. To put it in this context, uh, Menger was born in 1840. Wieser and Bombavik were both born in 1851. So Menger is 11 years older than them. They're all kind of relatively young if you think about people in their 30s and 40s, but Menger was older. So Menger publishes his book when he's in his early 30s. Wieser and Bombavik are in their 20s, early 20s, when they discover Menger's book. They go to graduate school and they begin publishing their works in the mid and late 1880s and then into the 1890s. Uh, and they're really the ones who formulate and make internationally known the Austrian school. It's really Wieser and Bombavik's writings that end up being translated into English, for example, in the 1890s, where Menger's own book on Principles of Economics was not translated into English until 1950. So the reputation and the knowledge of what becomes known as the Austrian school, because they were all born in Austria, comes more from Bombavik and Wieser's writings, and therefore through them, Menger's reputation as the founder of the school. I should just say, at least in passing, one other thing. Well, where did this name, the Austrian school, come from? It actually was a term, a derogatory term, because there was an element here that was unique in the German-speaking world. There was a dominant economic school of thought in Germany, and it was called the German Historical School. The leading figure of which was a political economist at the University of Berlin called Gustav von Schmoller. Now, this Gustav von Schmoller, like others and his own teachers, believed that there were no general laws of economics. All laws of economics were historically determined and relative to the specific period in which a society was evolving. So the laws of economics, supply and demand, market price, competition versus monopoly, whatever the laws of economics might have been for the Great Britain of the 1840s or the 1850s, had no relevance or meaning for the new laws, historically determined laws of economics of Imperial Germany in the 1880s and 1890s. They therefore said that what determines the institutions and the rules of economic life, it's determined by the history as defined by the governments in that society. So, for example, in Imperial Germany, this was the time of Otto von Bismarck and Kaiser Wilhelm I and II. They argued that it is the duty and the responsibility of government to decide what are the guiding laws of the economics of their society at that time, and in that context, to regulate, control, intervene, nationalize, or allow competition guided by the rules of pragmatism and expediency as the guideposts of real statesmanship. So if it seems appropriate to regulate an industry, regulate it. To leave it free, leave it free. To regulate wages, regulate them. If not, not. To superimpose a welfare state, because the Marxists are right. Capitalism is harsh and cruel to the worker. But we don't need to overthrow the whole system. We can reform it. We can regulate it. We can have social safety nets. And that's the beginning of the modern welfare state, with Social Security, national health care, unemployment insurance, the beginning of minimum wages. Now here come the Austrians, Menger, and then his strong knights building upon him, Wieser and Bombarik, and they say, no, the laws of economics apply to all men at all times. Man has to choose under scarcity. He has to evaluate the alternatives. He has to weigh things at the margin. He has to decide what is the cost and what is the benefit of things. There are the incentive mechanisms of when private property exists and are secure and when they're not. And this is true for the ancient man this is true for the man of ancient Athens as much as it is for the modern German and will be for the human being of 200 years into the future. The German economists revolted against this. You're saying that there's a force outside of government guiding the society. And they said, these are beneath a reasoned and rational and historically grounded economist. These are the mere Austrians, this little petty area that is not as great and as intellectually advanced as we Germans. So it was meant as a pejorative, derogatory term. But of course, what these Austrian economists started doing is proudly wearing this badge. We are the Austrian economists because we've explained the laws of value and markets and price, and we've been able to show the weaknesses, contradictions, and impossibilities of the thinking of not only the Marxists but our German historical colleagues across the border.
Yeah, that's fascinating because over here at about the same time, you've got the progressive movement taking place, starting up at the turn of the century, and that tremendous battle between the classical liberals and the progressives, including on the Supreme Court, the great battles that were taking place over economic due process. So this is a fascinating time in history,
Yeah, you
Richard.
yeah, the addition to that, and in fact, in one previous one of our presentations, we discussed this a little bit. You mentioned the American progressives. Well, how did these ideas get over to America? Because the fact is that in the 1880s and 1890s, and in the decade and a half before the First World War in the 20th century, one of the most popular places for young American scholars to go to capstone their education with a PhD, right, a doctoral degree, was to, in fact, to go study in Imperial Germany. Some were physicists, some were chemists, some were biologists. But when we talk about the social sciences, political science, economics, history, philosophy, and sociology, many of young American scholars wanting that capstone experience went off and studied at German universities with these members of the German historical school. There are no laws of economics. Things are determined by the historical relative circumstances of the moment. Capitalism is harsh. Government must be enlightened and guided by people like us who understand this. And they came back to America with their PhDs, the economists, the political scientists, the historians, the sociologists, the philosophers. And they became the leaders of the American progressive movement. They're the children of the German historical school and the partners of Bismarck in setting up the first regulatory interventionist welfare state in Imperial Germany, and then bringing those ideas over as progressivism to begin the process of transforming America with similar policies and attitudes and government interventions and safety nets in the America that we now take for granted.
Yep. So, and the battle goes on because people like you and me and other libertarians are the successors to Menger and Valra and Baumbaverk,
Yes,
Wieser. So obviously the battle goes on, and people might have started listening to us this hour and the previous show saying, what does this have to do with burning issues of the day? It has everything to do with the burning issues of the day. This shows you the origin, the historical origin, the philosophical origin of all the problems that we're facing in America today, both
absolutely.
domestically and in foreign policy as well.
Where are the guiding principles in politics today? And I include both conservatives in too many cases and liberals, certainly modern liberals, American liberals, or between generally speaking Republicans and Democrats. Where are the guiding principles that define what are the rights of individual human beings? What is the proper role of government in a society that grounds itself in the idea of individual liberty? Neither party, neither philosophic wing of conservatives or modern American liberals have such. They're guided by pragmatism, expediency, the changing circumstances of the moment, the short run. That guides their thinking. And in that too, they are the great grandchildren of those German historical school thinkers who then influenced the early American progressives. We don't ask the questions of first principles and then are guided by rightly thinking first principles. No, we just plod along day by day in the changing circumstances of expediency and necessity. And therefore America is too a victim of the German thinkers of a century ago.
All right. Well, on that note, Richard, we're past time here. Why don't we continue next time with a discussion of what happens from here on out, both with the other two economists as well as the development of the Austrian school.
Yes, and then to go on to a discussion of the other branch of economics that has transformed the 20th century in various ways, and we'll see whether good or bad, macroeconomics.
The reference to Keynes, of course.
Yes.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you for tuning in, Richard. Enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week.